Hook it up, quickly!
We are looking into the water situation.
The fountains went dry first. Nobody noticed at 6:40 in the morning when the marble basin in front of Solace Springs Resort finished draining itself down to a thin skin of mineral dust, and the booster pump beneath it kept clicking on and shutting off over and over, like something trying to find a pulse that wasn't there anymore. By 7, the infinity pool on the west terrace had stopped climbing toward its overflow edge and simply stopped, 6 inches short of full, glassy, and still under a sky that was already turning the color of a blowtorch. By 7:30, the director of housekeeping was standing in a half-finished guest suite, with a phone pressed to her ear trying to explain to someone above her why 11 bathtubs on the east wing were filling with a trickle, and then nothing at all. And why the spa's signature hydrotherapy room, the one on the brochure, the one with floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over the canyon, hadn't filled past 4 inches in 20 minutes of running. And by 8 o'clock, the general manager of a $14 million wellness resort was standing at a cattle gate 2 miles down the access road, hat in his hands, asking a 64-year-old widow to please reconsider. Mrs. Hale. Pruitt's voice had the careful, pleading register of a man watching his career evaporate in real time. We open in 4 hours. Eleanor Hale didn't look up from the brass valve she was tightening at the head of her irrigation line. I'm aware of the time, Mr. Pruitt. There are people on the road behind me, investors flying in from Phoenix, a wire reporter. Somebody from the governor's tourism office is supposed to cut a ribbon at 11. He gestured back down the switchback, where a line of cars had already begun stacking up against the gravel shoulder, engines idling in heat that hadn't even peaked yet. We need water in that building by noon, or there isn't going to be an opening day at all. Then I expect you've got some disappointing phone calls ahead of you. She straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans, and finally looked at him, not unkindly, just plainly, the way she might look at a man who'd wandered onto her land looking for something that had never belonged to him. Same as I told the last 3 men your company sent up this road, that spring was never part of the deal, it was never on the table to begin with. Pruitt's jaw worked. Behind him, a tanker truck, somebody's last-minute idea. Hauling municipal water 2 hours up a mountain grade, was grinding its way toward the back of the line, and even from the gate Eleanor could tell by the angle of the truck against the slope that it wasn't going to be nearly enough. Not for 140 rooms, 6 pools, and a spa that had been advertised in 4-color print as having the purest natural water in the Southwest. That water was hers, it always had been. And what none of those people gathered at her gate that morning seemed able to accept, even after 4 years of letters and lawyers, and a half-built monument to their own certainty rising on the ridge above her ranch, was that she had told them exactly this. In plain English, on the very first afternoon they ever set foot on her land, 3.5 years before a single shovel broke ground, and not one of them had believed her enough to listen. Eleanor had buried her husband Walter 8 months before the first men from Meridian Crest ever came up her road, and she would think more than once over the years that followed that the timing hadn't been an accident. Companies like that had people whose entire job was finding land where the owner might be tired, might be alone, might be more interested in being left in peace than in fighting for something on paper. They had found her at exactly that moment, widowed, 60 years old, running 400 acres on her own for the first time in 36 years of marriage, and they had clearly expected that to mean something it hadn't. If anything, it had made her more stubborn, not less, because the spring wasn't just hers. It was Walter's grandfather's, a Welsh stonemason named Idris Hale who'd filed the water right in 1931 after spending 2 summers with a dowsing rod and a shovel proving there was something worth filing for. It was Walter's father's, who'd run cattle through 3 droughts on water that never once failed him. It was Walter's who had taught Eleanor how to read the flow gauge before they were even married. Sitting on the edge of the spring box on a July evening, with his sleeves rolled up telling her that whatever else happened to this family, that water would never run out, and would never belong to anybody who hadn't earned it. So when 3 men in clean boots and pressed shirts showed up at her door that first October afternoon, Eleanor let them in, gave them coffee, and listened, because that was what you did with neighbors, even new ones, even ones who hadn't built anything yet. The one doing the talking introduced himself as Russell Voss, CEO of a hospitality group out of Scottsdale called Meridian Crest. He had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like it had already happened, not "we'd like to build a resort," but "when the resort opens." He set a leather portfolio down on Eleanor's kitchen table, the same table Walter had built 30 years earlier out of a fallen cottonwood, and unrolled architectural renderings that looked lifted straight from a glossy travel magazine. Sandstone buildings staggered up the hillside. Infinity pools cantilevered over the canyon. A 200-foot spa wing labeled in elegant serif-type Solace. It's going to put this whole valley on the map, Voss said. 40 million in projected economic impact over 10 years. Jobs your neighbor's kids will actually be able to keep instead of driving 2 hours each way to the city. Eleanor studied the renderings for a long moment before she said anything. Then she put her finger down on the spa wing, on a thin blue line that ran from a drawn wellhead straight across the property boundary through her south pasture and up to a labeled reservoir tank on the resort side. What's this? That's the water main, Voss said, as though it were the smallest detail on the page. Routine, standard infrastructure for a project this size, running across my land. A short easement, that's all, a formality. Our engineers drilled a test well on our own parcel, but unfortunately it came in too high in dissolved minerals to use safely for the spa program or the kitchens. So we'll need to tap into the aquifer on your side instead. It's a shared system, geologically speaking. That water doesn't really belong to either of us specifically. It belongs to whoever holds the appropriative right, Eleanor said, and that's been my husband's family since 1931. Voss smiled the kind of smile that had clearly worked on other people in other rooms, more times than she cared to imagine, and slid a folder across the table. An offer, 6 figures, more money than the ranch had cleared in the last decade combined. She didn't open it. I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Voss, and I'd like you to actually hear it, because I don't think the men who scouted this valley before you ever did. Build whatever you like up on that ridge. 100 rooms, 200, every pool and steam room you can dream up on a sheet of paper. But there is exactly one reliable, year-round water source within 6 miles of that site, and it comes up out of the ground on my land, under a right my husband's grandfather filed before either of our fathers were born. If I don't sign that easement, you are going to open the doors on a $14 million building with nothing coming out of the taps. For just a second, something flickered behind Voss's eyes, not doubt exactly, more like irritation. The expression of a man being handed an inconvenient fact rather than useful information. Everybody comes around eventually, he said, closing the folder himself since she hadn't. We'll be in touch. They rolled up the drawings, shook her hand on the porch, and drove back down the same dirt road they'd come in on. Eleanor figured that would be the last she heard of it. It wasn't. 3 months later, a different car came up the drive, not Voss this time, but a junior associate from Meridian Crest's land department, who didn't ask for Eleanor at all. He asked for her son, Daniel, who was 31, lived 2 hours away in Tucson, and held a small, mostly symbolic minority interest in the ranch LLC that Walter had set up years earlier for tax purposes. The associate had a document with him, a consent to easement, that, if signed by any single member of the LLC, would have allowed Meridian Crest's lawyers to argue the entire membership had agreed. Daniel called his mother before he'd finished reading the first paragraph. They said you already knew about this, he told her. They said it was just a formality to round out the paperwork. They've used that word with me too, Eleanor said. It seems to be the only one they know. Daniel didn't sign anything. But the attempt told Eleanor something important, something she repeated to her lawyer not long after. This wasn't a company that had simply misunderstood her position. This was a company actively looking for a side door because they already knew the front door was locked. Not everyone in the valley thought she was right to keep that door shut. Holly's Rays, who'd run the diner at the bottom of the highway for 30 years and who'd known Eleanor since before either of them had gray in their hair, brought it up gently one morning over coffee she hadn't asked for. Folks are saying it could be 200 jobs, Eleanor. Maintenance, kitchen, the spa staff. My granddaughter's been talking about training as a massage therapist if that place opens. I hope it does open, Holly's. I just don't see how it opens without my water, and I don't see why that should be my problem to solve for them. Some people think you're just being stubborn for the sake of it, punishing them for not asking nicely the first time. Let them think it. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. I'm not punishing anybody. I'm holding on to the one thing in this family that's never once depended on somebody else's good intentions. If they want those jobs to exist, they know exactly what they need to do. They've known it since the first afternoon they sat at my table. Holly's didn't argue with her, but she didn't quite agree either. And Eleanor understood that some of that same quiet doubt was moving through the valley in low conversations at the feed store and the church parking lot. Not hostility exactly, just the particular discomfort of watching one woman hold up something everyone else had already decided to want. For nearly 2 years after that, Eleanor didn't hear another word directly from Meridian Crest. She didn't need to. She could see it the same way everyone in the valley could see it. The ridge above Hale Springs Ranch slowly filling with cranes and concrete trucks and crews working through the heat of 2 full summers, raising sandstone walls exactly where the renderings had promised they would go. She kept waiting for someone to come back down the hill and ask her properly, the way you ask a neighbor for something instead of assuming you're owed it. Nobody ever did. Instead, in the spring of the second year, a courier delivered a thick envelope informing her that Meridian Crest intended to pursue what its lawyers called a necessity easement through the county, on the theory that the resort's water infrastructure constituted a matter of regional economic significance. Maps were attached. Engineering reports were attached. None of it carried her signature on a single page. She hired her own lawyer, a sharp, soft-spoken woman out of the county seat named Renata Cruz, who read through the filing twice and looked up with an expression Eleanor would remember for a long time afterward. "They don't have the right," Cruz said. "Not unless a judge invents one out of thin air for them. Your family's appropriative water right predates their land patent by 90 years. There's no legal theory in this state that lets a private company condemn a senior water right just because their own well came in bad." She tapped the filing, but that won't stop them from building. Companies like this don't wait for permission. They bet on getting it after the fact, once there's a finished building and a deadline and enough public pressure to make a judge feel like the clock matters more than the law. She was right. Construction never slowed, not for a single week of the lawsuit that followed. Cruz deposed Voss herself, 11 months into the case, in a conference room in Phoenix with a court reporter typing quietly in the corner. Eleanor sat in on it, at Cruz's invitation, mostly silent. "Mr. Voss, at the time you presented Mrs. Hale with renderings showing a water main crossing her property. Had Meridian Crest secured any legal right to construct that infrastructure? We were in good faith negotiations. That's not what I asked. Had you secured the right? Not at that specific juncture, no. And construction began regardless. Construction began on schedule. These projects run on financing timelines, counsel. Investors don't wait around for a single landowner to make up her mind. Did your own engineering team ever advise you that the project's water supply was not secured?" There was the smallest pause, no longer than a breath. "I'd have to review the file before answering that." "Take your time," Cruz said, and slid a folder across the table that Eleanor recognized because she had a copy of the same one sitting at home in a drawer in a manila sleeve marked simply with a date. Voss didn't open it. He didn't need to. Whatever was inside it, he already knew, and the flicker across his face told Eleanor more than any answer he gave for the rest of that afternoon. Construction kept going straight through discovery, through that deposition, through a mediation session that went nowhere because Meridian Crest's negotiators kept circling back to bigger numbers instead of acknowledging the actual problem, as though enough money could simply override a right that had never been for sale. By the time a hearing date was finally set, the resort on the ridge was substantially finished. 140 rooms, 6 pools, a spa with floor-to-ceiling glass, and a grand opening printed on glossy invitations mailed to 200 guests splashed across a regional tourism campaign. Locked onto the second weekend of October. What none of those 200 guests knew, what even most of Meridian Crest's own investors didn't know, was that buried inside the discovery documents Cruz had spent 18 months prying loose sat a hydrology report commissioned by Meridian Crest itself. Dated 14 months before a single concrete truck ever climbed that ridge, the report was blunt. It stated that the resort's own well, drawing from the shallow basin on its own parcel, would produce water too high in dissolved salts to safely operate spa, kitchen, or laundry systems at the scale proposed. It stated that sustainable operation would require access to the deeper artesian aquifer, reached through the spring on the adjoining Hale property. And in its closing recommendation, in language Eleanor read 3 times just to be sure she understood it correctly, it stated that construction should not proceed past the foundation phase until water rights for the adjoining parcel had been formally secured. Meridian Crest's own engineers had told them in writing before a single slab was poured that the resort could not function without water that wasn't theirs to take. They built it anyway, all $14 million of it, on a promise nobody had ever actually made them. The night before opening day, Voss came up the road himself for the first time since that first afternoon at her kitchen table. No portfolio this time, no renderings, just a man in an expensive jacket standing at her gate in the dark, headlights still running behind him. "Name a number, Mrs. Hale, any number. I'll have a check drawn up tonight. You already tried that 4 years ago. My answer hasn't changed because your deadline got closer. 200 people are arriving tomorrow. Reservations, a wedding party, press." You'd really let all of that fall apart over a piece of paper from 1931. It's not the paper I'm protecting, Mr. Voss. It's everything that paper was supposed to mean, that some things don't get taken just because somebody else wants them badly enough, or built something expensive enough, or waited long enough for the other side to get tired. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I told you what would happen the very first day you sat at my table. You're not hearing anything new tonight. You're just finally close enough to it to feel it. Voss stood there a moment longer, like he was waiting for the conversation to turn into something he recognized, some final negotiation where the right amount of patience or money tipped the answer his way. It never came. He got back in his car, and the headlights swung back down the mountain, and Eleanor went to bed knowing exactly what the next morning would bring, because she had been telling them what the next morning would bring for nearly 4 years. Opening day came whether Meridian Crest was ready for it or not, and for the first hour, it looked like the bet might somehow pay off after all. Cars started climbing the ridge road a little after 8 that morning, couples already dressed in resort robes for the drive. A tour bus chartered for a travel influencer with 200,000 followers, a black SUV carrying a representative from the governor's tourism office scheduled to cut a ceremonial ribbon at 11. The lobby smelled like sage and citrus. A string quartet was setting up folding chairs on the terrace. Everything had been built exactly the way the renderings promised, down to the polished river stones lining the entrance fountain. The fountain just wasn't running. A young couple named the Alvarados had booked the resort's very first vow-renewal package, 10 years married, flowers already ordered, photographer already paid. By 9:15, the bride was standing in her robe in the spa's reception area, increasingly less calm by the minute, asking why the signature-soaking ritual she'd paid $400 for kept getting pushed back another 20 minutes. By 9:40, the spa director, a woman who had managed 3 other resort openings without incident, was standing in the hydrotherapy pool in her good shoes, watching 4 inches of water shimmer uselessly across the bottom of a basin built to hold 4 feet. In the kitchen, the executive chef was trying to run a brunch service for 200 guests on a faucet that delivered water in irregular gasps, like a held breath being let out in pieces. He sent 2 line cooks down to the loading dock with every clean pot in the building, hoping the catering truck still had bottled water left over from the morning delivery. It didn't. By 10, half the rooms on the east wing had reported the same thing, showers running for 90 seconds, and then sputtering into nothing. By 10:30, 3 more executives from the Phoenix office had joined Prout at Eleanor's gate, suits already wilting in heat that hadn't peaked yet, phones pressed to their ears with the particular urgency of men watching numbers they could no longer control. One tried reasoning. One tried something closer to a threat, mentioning lawyers and a hearing date that hadn't even happened yet. A third, younger and visibly out of his depth, simply stood at the gate staring up the road toward the resort like a man watching a ship he was aboard take on water. "You don't understand what you're doing to us," the second one finally said, once reasoning and threats had both run out. "I told your company exactly what I'd do 4 years ago at my own kitchen table," Eleanor said. "Mr. Voss has the same memory I do." "You're welcome to ask him." By 11, the tanker truck Prout had arranged the night before finally crested the grade hauling municipal water at a cost Eleanor would later learn was $9,000 for a load that kept the kitchen and 2 guest floors limping along for barely 90 minutes. By 11:15, the ribbon cutting had quietly moved indoors and then quietly been canceled altogether, after the tourism representative asked, not unreasonably, why there was no water in the building she'd flown 2 hours to help celebrate. Calvin Boyer, the managing partner of Meridian Crest's largest institutional backer, had flown in from Denver that morning, expecting to spend the afternoon shaking hands at a ribbon cutting, and the evening signing off on a press release about the fund's transformative hospitality investment. Instead, he spent it walking the property with Prout watching housekeeping carts sit idle outside rooms. Nobody could clean watching the spa director stand in 4 inches of water in a basin built for 4 feet. Watching the kitchen staff portion out the last of the bottled water like it was rationed fuel, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply took out his phone, stepped onto the empty terrace where the string quartet had packed up an hour earlier, and made the first of several calls that would, within a month, end with his fund formally withdrawing its remaining capital commitment. A guest with a phone in his hand had been filming the line of cars and the dry fountain since shortly after sunrise, narrating in the bored, half-amused tone of someone documenting a minor travel inconvenience rather than the unraveling of a $14 million bet. By noon, his video had been picked up and shared by accounts with audiences far larger than his own. By that evening, a local news van was parked at the bottom of the access road. Not for the grand opening reel Meridian Crest had hired its own crew to shoot, but for a stranger and more interesting story. A luxury resort that on the day it opened had apparently forgotten to confirm whether the water it needed actually belonged to it. The story didn't stay local for long. By the next morning, it had reached 2 regional papers and a wire service. By the end of the week, the angle had shifted from curious to damning. Once a reporter filed a records request and obtained the same hydrology report crews had spent a year and a half extracting through discovery, the one in which Meridian Crest's own engineers had warned 14 months before groundbreaking. That this exact failure was not a remote possibility but close to a certainty. The investors who had flown in for the ribbon cutting did not fly back for a second visit. Within a month, 2 of Meridian Crest's 3 institutional backers, including Boyer's Fund, had pulled their remaining capital commitments, citing, in a brief joint statement, material undisclosed operational risk identified after the property's opening. Voss tried for a while to hold the line in the press, calling Eleanor's water right an outdated relic of a bygone era, in one interview that did considerably more damage to his own position than to hers. A quote that local commentators and at least one editorial board seized on as proof that the company had never seen the problem as a mistake worth correcting. Only an inconvenience worth complaining about. But the lawsuit had nowhere left to go once the hydrology report became part of the public record. A judge who had been patient through 18 months of motions needed less than a week once the facts were finally laid out in open court. To confirm exactly what crews had told Eleanor at the very beginning, the right was hers, had always been hers, and no amount of money or architectural ambition could manufacture a claim that had never existed in law to begin with. The Alvarados, as it happened, were given a full refund, and a story they would apparently tell at dinner parties for years afterward. The resort that opened with no water, the bride who renewed her vows in a hotel bathrobe with a single bottle of sparkling water for 200 guests. The photographer who ended up shooting most of the day from the parking lot where at least there was shade. The resort never opened again, not that week, not that season, not at all. By the following spring, Meridian Crest Hospitality Group had been formally dissolved. Its remaining assets, 140 empty rooms, 6 dry pools, a spa with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a canyon nobody was soaking in, sold off at auction to a regional hotel group that, as far as Eleanor ever heard, had no immediate plans to reopen the property at all. Voss himself simply stopped appearing in trade press after that. The man who had once told her everybody comes around eventually had bet $14 million on the idea that a widow with a spring on her land would eventually be one more person who came around. And in the end, that bet had cost him the entire company. Daniel drove up from Tucson the week the news broke, and he and Eleanor walked down to the spring together the way he used to as a boy, before he'd left for college, before his father died, before any of this had started. The flow gauge read exactly what it always read. The water came up out of the ground clean and cold, indifferent to everything that had been built and lost on the ridge above it. Grandpa Idris really just walked around with a dowsing rod, Daniel said, half a question. 2 whole summers, Eleanor said. Your father used to say it was the only inheritance in this family that never once let anybody down. Holly's brought her a slice of pie a few weeks later, the kind of unspoken apology that didn't need actual words attached to it, and admitted over the counter that her granddaughter had ended up training as a massage therapist anyway, just at a spa 2 towns over that had taken the trouble to drill its own well properly the first time. Maybe that's the lesson in it, Holly said. Not that the jobs weren't worth wanting, just that nobody should have had to take what wasn't theirs to get them. These days, Eleanor still walks down to the spring most mornings before the heat sets in, same as she has for 40 years, same as Walter did before her, same as his father and his father's father before that. The valve still needs tightening every so often. From her porch, if she looks up past the cottonwoods, she can still see the resort sitting empty on the ridge. Sandstone walls catching the morning light, glass towers reflecting a sky nobody is paying to look at from inside a heated pool. $14 million of stone and steel, built on the certainty that a piece of paper in a developer's portfolio would eventually matter more than a right that had been settled law for 90 years before anyone ever drew up those renderings. Nobody asks her to sign anything anymore. Nobody comes up the road with leather portfolios and offers folded into manila envelopes. The only sound most mornings is the spring itself running the same way it always has, belonging to exactly the person it was always going to belong to, not because she fought hardest, or held out longest, or wanted it more than they did, but because it had simply never been theirs to take in the first place, no matter how many drawings they made of it, no matter how many cranes they raised above it. P55. They spent $14 million trying to take the one thing that was never for sale. And in the end, the single signature they never got cost them everything they built around it. They built a $14 million desert resort. Then they needed her Spring AI image generation prompts character sheets plus full scene-by-scene style. Cinematic, vibrant, colorful, Ultra HD, works well on Midjourney, Leonardo AI, DALL-E3, and Adobe Firefly. Paste directly or tell me if you want platform-specific versions, MJ parameters, Firefly safe phrasing, etc.